Hail to the king, baby.
Welcome to this episode of Kingology. We're your host, Mark, and today I am again joined by Herman.
Hi there, everybody.
Good to have you on again. We are again talking about the Dark Tower. We're getting into number 2 now, the drawing of the 3. It's quite kind of nice. We've got our own little quartet here, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm ready for our palaver.
So this was written some years after the first editions of the Gunslinger, but it actually appeared reasonably quickly after the more general release of the Gunslinger.
That's right. Yeah.
So it wasn't like people were sitting around. A lot of people weren't sitting around for years waiting for this second edition, because the first one, for most people that read it, I would imagine, wasn't that long before this. So this was published in 1987. As I think I mentioned last time, the whole series is kind of inspired by the poem by Robert Browning, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. And it continues the story of the Gunslinger pretty much almost straight after that story, right? It kind of slams straight in. Apparently the subtitle of this novel, which I've never seen before, but this is according to Wikipedia, is Renewal, which is an interesting subtitle for this story.
I think I must have picked up the later edition too, Mark, because I can't remember this being on my books at all. But it kind of makes sense, Renewal, if you think about it, because kind of Roland, he's a pretty man with no name character in the first book. And in this book, we see a bit of Achilles' heels coming to the fore, and we also see all these broken characters being thrown at us. So it's not like the first novel where he's almost invulnerable. Yeah. So he is kind of renewed as a character, probably a more likable character, or a more character you can identify with a bit more.
Indeed. It's, there is... We'll get into the nitty gritty in the scenes, but there is a distinct moment where he thinks where, I'm at the, I'm in the middle of nowhere, I've got nothing. This is a point of change and stuff like that. That's the kind of vibe in a tiny little bit near the beginning. Anyway, I should mention we're going to be having spoilers throughout this episode. So if you haven't read this book, there you go. Listener beware. You're gonna hear all about it if you carry on. So right. This picks up around 7 hours after the end of the Dark Tower. So we already mentioned, the end of the Gunslinger was him palavering with the Man in Black, and then waking up after could be 10 years. It depends what you read. Sometime later, in fact, the skeleton of water is kind of laid out, and then Roland sort of starts heading north. That comes on. Right. But anyway, he wakes up on a beach, and we get a really peculiar thing here. Now, King consistently in this book, I have to say, keeps making decisions that feels like to me he's an author writing himself into a corner somewhat, which is really interesting. For example, right at the beginning here, the weird creatures which are termed the lobstrosities, the weird lobster-like creatures that sort of talk. They sort of talk, don't they? Check a dam, check a D, all this. The lobstrosities actually attack him and chop off some of his fingers. And which sounds like a peculiar thing to do to a gunslinging character.
Right off the bat, I think King felt the need to hobble him a bit, because maybe from the get-go he saw that this character was like you said in the previous episode, Mark, similar to Judge Dredd or Superman or even Bond, James Bond.
He's like
almost
a super
unbeatable.
Warrior kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think King made a good decision here, because the Gunslinger is basically indomitable. Indomitable. He cannot be beaten. So I think for him to be kind of hurt in this fundamental way, it sort of gives it a bit more of a realistic quality, because Stephen King is good at putting realism in these supernatural, stories. And I think this is I think it was a good decision on his part. But like you say, it does kind of make you feel like, what the hell, right off the bat.
And to mention another big one that always struck me, that's later on in this book, so again, I'm going to stress there's spoilers throughout this podcast about the whole book, is the fact he made one of his main characters of this group without legs. That seemed to be amazing. When
all of these broken characters, right, Mark? That's what he throws at us.
Physically and mentally broken characters. It's interesting because I'm a bit of a writer and I sort of read writing advice. And one of the things I remember reading is bad writers don't. I've forgotten the advice now. Essentially, bad writers write themselves into a corner. Good writers write themselves into a corner which they could get out of. It's something along those lines. And King kind of does that. If I were a writer and I wrote a character like this, I would at some point think, no, I've got to change this. This is a bad idea. I'm just making difficulties for myself down the line. But King doesn't do that. He famously follows his muse, doesn't he?
That's right.
A lot of his work is unplanned. He'll just write and write. And luckily, he has the talent to do that. A lot of writers don't have that talent. They need a little more planning. And he does occasionally plan books, but more often than not, he just follows his muse. And he likes to surprise himself. And sometimes it's a bit unfortunate. We get some things we as readers find quite objectionable, actually, in some of King's work. But I think more of the time it's a hit than a miss. It feels like, certainly once it's got to the publication stage anyway. But there's a few major sort of what feel like missteps to me in the King universe, but mostly they're not missteps. They end up working.
It's sort of like a patchwork quilt that he presents to you with all these things that probably during the editing process he saw, doesn't work. But he's famous for saying, kill your babies. But for me, it feels like some of the babies he just couldn't kill, when it came to... he just kept them and maybe reworked them. And for me, it always works because King is more of a writer that sort of, like you say, follows the muse, but also he is very imaginative, so if he does come up with some kind of a problem, especially when it comes to the plot, he sort of reworks that. And I think it helps with his supernatural settings. You can basically do anything, even introduce a deus ex machina, which kind of happens in some of the Dark Tower books, where he introduces some supernatural element to change the setting, which we'll see probably later as Roland progresses down the beach, right, Mark? There's things that appear.
It certainly does. Actually, one of the points you just made actually makes me think of the next book in this chronological series, which I'm really not going to get into too much. I just want to mention Misery. Yeah. In Misery, which I'll be covering on the next show, he actually has a point where the guy that's trapped with Annie Wilkes, Paul, isn't it? Paul.
Paul.
He comes up with this sort of creative way of bringing back the heroine of his main stories, and Annie Wilkes gets annoyed at him and says, "You're just cheating." And then we get a whole perspective of the author saying, "Yep, I was cheating," realizing, "Yep, I was cheating." Yeah. It's like when they cheat in Flash Gordon, where we see something on the next episode that we didn't see in the previous one that helps them escape. That's just cheating, that kind of made me think. Anyway, I'm going to get onto that next time. So basically, he gets attacked. He loses 2 fingers of his right hand, his shooting hand, right? He does actually stress that he can shoot with both hands. Maybe a bit rusty with the left, but he can do it. Part of his his big toe, one of his big toes. Yeah. But he manages to sort of kill the beast. These wounds start to become infected, so he's got some sort of blood poisoning, and it seems to be quite severe as well. He starts to get feverish. He starts to try and walk, and we get this kind of sort of this piece of writing talking about how he's kind of going, just keeps going. He's kind of indomitable that way, but it's really, really hard for him.
Well, Mark, I want to quickly interject. Did you find the part where he has to clean his guns and check his bullet casings and his bullets? Did you find that part particularly harrowing because other writers probably won't do that. Fantasy writers, they'll skip over these realistic parts. But his gunner, like he calls it, got wet, right? So his guns and his bullets got wet, and for him, his bullets are his life. He had to check them, but he has to check them with this, mangled hand. And, feeling this pain while he's doing it all the time. And he meticulously checks each bullet. And King, he's the only writer, I think, who would do that. You have this guy maimed like this, and then you turn this simple act of checking your gear into this horror scene of pain, where he, has to, one by one, disassemble the bullets and the guns to clean them. Because it's his life, right?
Yeah, I thought it was very. It kind of really told you about the soul of Roland. He's fundamentally, it's what he's about. You do not let your weapons get hurt, right? The bullets, right. He was concerned with the bullets, but the guns were the main thing, right? It was.
Yeah, that's right.
It was kind of, you kind of felt for him, and he was kind of weak and nauseous and. It just carried on. Really quite effective. In fact, the whole scene was... not scene. It was like a whole section. Of him kind of trying to get through this blood poison was very effective. And it kind of... unfortunately, it's been a long time since I read this, and I cannot remember how I felt the first time through this section, because I much more remember how I felt with the sections to come, where he goes to different sort of histories, because they're just more striking to the memory. But this was pretty dark stuff.
Yeah, I remember I was quite upset at this time because when I read it, I was a kid, and my heroes back then was like Conan, Conan the Barbarian, Robert E. Howard, and I always hated the stories where it started with Conan being hobbled or being, sort of limited by some sort of situation. So I thought, no, this is not a good fit for me, like having Roland scarred like this. So I was immediately against it. But then as it progressed, when you see what the gunslinger is capable of, even when he's so, fundamentally hurt and he's become a lesser man to an effect, but he's still so incredibly effective, which we'll see later on.
He's got a soul of iron. In effect, we get this whole section of him doing these guns. He's infected, he's damaged, he's feeling dizzy, he's feeling weak. But we does have this sort of short paragraph, which I wish I had verbatim, but I haven't got it to hand, where he basically says, I'm on the edge of everything. I am at the limit now. Not in a distressed way, but it's just a realization that it doesn't really get any worse than this. I just have to keep going. He's lost everything pretty much. He doesn't even know if any of his bullets will. Certainly his wet bullet. He doesn't know if any of those wet bullets will work.
That's right.
All he can do is prepare. By having those guns clean, right? And hope
that's the only thing.
Because if those guns weren't cleaned, they wouldn't be usable at all, even with good bullets. Anyway, he carries on, and then he comes across he finds about 3 doors, doesn't he? I was confused here because some of the writing's a little confusing. Sometimes it reads like he sees 3 doors, which I think he does the very first time, but then once he opens one, the others disappear, and he kind of senses what the next ones will appear if he continues his journey. But it's not really belaboured, is it? That it's kind of
no.
Just sort of
It's got. The fact that he's racked with fever at this point in time and probably hallucinating makes the whole beach scene. The entire novel set on the beach. It makes it very surreal. For me. And, I like that part, having him see the doors and then, the first door is there. And, so I didn't mind that at all. I found this to be quite refreshing because now there's a way off the beach, and back onto the beach sort of. But like I said, it's very surreal. A door appearing. But him being fever struck makes it more believable for me.
Indeed. It's got an element of almost Monty Python, hasn't it? Doors on a beach, or Alice in Wonderland.
Good point.
Or
Yeah.
I remember, I think the first time I saw Monsters Inc. when there was just doors there, it made me think of this book.
Yeah, I thought of that as well. Yeah, the doors from Monster Inc. I thought, hey man, that they've stolen that from King.
So the first door is labelled The Prisoner. And we're kind of we're just thrust into an entirely new sort of story, aren't we? Where we get Eddie, basically a young man called Eddie, who's kind of charming. We get that sense that he's charming. It turns out he's kind of a drug mule, in effect.
Yeah.
He's
a junkie.
He's a heroin addict. And this relates back to Rowland's tarot reading, right? Where it talks about a man who's got a demon on his back called heroin. And he says, heroin, I've never heard of that, right? He says, I've never heard that demon's name.
Yeah, we have to remind the listeners, too, that this is all the Man in Black's prophecy, saying that 3 is the number of Rowland's fate. 3 doors, but also 3 individuals who are going to play a role in his destiny, help him on the path to the Dark Tower. This is the first of those, Eddie Dean, and the Man in Black's tarot card labeled him the prisoner, and he had this on the tarot card. He had a picture of this huge baboon with a whip on a young man's back.
Yeah,
and I think also a naked young man, which might sort of,
it certainly had a weird sort of sexual possibly element. It was a fearsome sort of monkey. Sorry, I said demon on his back. It was monkey, but he says they do describe it as demon heroin.
No, true. I mean, the slang of having a monkey on your back is well known in the States. That means you're basically a junkie. But Mark, before we continue, I have to mention something here. This Eddie Dean is my absolute favorite Stephen King character. I just love him. I love him.
Very well written. Yes,
I love him. I love his zingers, his quips, his one-liners, his personality. I even got into his sort of New York accent. When I recently listened to the audiobook, the guy who reads it does a great kind of Brooklynish, as Eddie says, he's from Co-op City, right? He does a great accent. So that's a sort of a new dimension of Eddie Dean that I experienced recently. I just love the guy. He's the best King character for me, by far.
I have to say the audiobooks of this series are very well written. Very well read. And Eddie Dean in particular comes out as a very strong and likable character in those audiobooks. They're really well represented. So, I agree with you there that Eddie Dean is quite an interesting and likable character.
For a junkie.
Even though he's a junkie and he's doing things wrong, he's basically a good-hearted person who kind of got sucked into a life with his brother, really, who was a weaker and sort of lesser man.
Scarred by Vietnam, right? He was scarred by his time in Vietnam, and that caused his heroin addiction, which sort of piggybacked onto Eddie. Because Eddie had this sense of guilt, I think, that drove him because of, his mother actually saddling Eddie with this sense of guilt because everybody had to take care of Eddie. And, Henry, his older brother, lost the opportunity to go to study and to make a better man of himself, all because of Eddie. And everybody kept, putting this on his shoulders. And that's why he always felt the need to take care of Henry. And, it immediately shows you a depth to Eddie's character, and like we mentioned before, Mark's King with character development is unequaled by anybody, I think.
Yeah, it's really terrific. In fact, all of the characters here are really well represented. Rowland's probably the least represented in some ways, right?
That's right.
But that's fine. That's fine as far as I'm concerned, because Rowland needs to be slightly enigmatic.
That's right.
I think compared to the others, but the others get their full reign, and we'll come on to some of the later ones in a bit. But those ones, again, King's written a really interesting backstory for some of the characters. Ed is one of the more straightforward ones, in fact, right? But it's still kind of rich. There's a touch of the, I don't know, it's not as depressing as sort of Selby Junior's Last Exit to Brooklyn, but it's not quite as cheerful as, say, Damon Runyon. But it's got that New York vibe, right?
Good comparison. Yeah. Exactly. It might even be.
It's probably more Runyon-esque than sort of
more
Last Exit to Brooklyn, which is totally depressing. Possibly
that's right.
The guy that wrote the book, was it The Wanderers? Richard Price, was it The Wanderers, that giving us a slice
I'm
of
not sure now.
gang life. That was kind of interesting, but also a bit quite downbeat. So I'm going to stick with Runyon, actually. There's
Runyon's the best example. And it's a good point you just made about the gangs, because, this is definitely set in, a gangster story, a mob. Stephen King's take on the New York mob, basically. That's where Eddie's setting is. His backstory comes from there. So
King's not bad at doing mobsters. In other words, in Thinner, for example, who I think the mobster in Thinner may have some sort of relationship to Balazar in this story, but I could be wrong.
I think you're right. And what's that book called? I think it's The Dark Tower of Concordance, or it's the Stephen King Companion. I'm not sure now which one, but they link those two.
Yeah, I read the Companion recently, and I think it was there I read the reference to this. So I think it was the Companion.
Maybe the listeners can also chime in with that, because I'm not sure about that part. I'm not a big. I know Thinner, but I've only read it once. So
yeah, and there's there's other works he does with gangsters that it's pretty good. Yeah, I've only read I think some of his later works, which I haven't read, have certain elements of gangsters in them. I think it's Dolan's Cadillac. I mean, I haven't got to that point because it's in Nightmare and Dreamscapes, but I think
the short story. That's a great one.
There's in that one too. And there's also road work. Is road work gangsters? There's a few. They're very similar to the character in this book.
Well, Mark, what do you think about King's names here? I mean, Balazar's the head honcho when it comes to the mob that has Eddie as their drug mule, but then he's got some great Italian mobster names for the henchmen. I mean, you got a guy called Trix Postino, Jack Andolini, and his brother Claudio. And there's a guy called Chimi Dretto and George Biondi, and another guy called Rudy Vecchio. And then suddenly you just have a guy called Kevin Blake.
No, I didn't catch that. It never jumped out at me, but yes, it is very odd. Some of the names definitely made me think of The Godfather.
Yeah, exactly. This was Stephen King's
for example.
Exactly.
There's definitely Italian gangsters, all right? Sorry, go on.
No. I was just going to say, in terms of Eddie, though, he obviously is a drug mule for this Enrico Balazar, this guy called Il Rocca, the Rock, right? And one of his henchmen even calls him Da Boss, which is what he got from an old Dick Tracy strip. So this is sort of King writing caricatures of mobsters. And later on, we'll also see he writes a caricature of, Butterfly McQueen, when we get to another character later on. But I think King, he likes to create his own caricatures of famous archetypes. And this is him writing the mobster archetype. Later on.
It definitely feels like that.
But it's good.
It's kind of... I like it. It's got a certain vibe and sort of patina that I liked quite a lot. Because they weren't like thoroughly evil monsters. They they reveled in their words, right? They had a way of talking, like Runyon, right? It's
exactly.
That feel. I really the way that Roland becomes becomes familiar with this world is kind of striking. It starts with Roland looking and kind of seeing like the world high up. And then he suddenly realises it's through a window, and he realises he's in some sort of travelling vehicle. Basically, he's looking out of a plane. He's looking out of a plane window. And then we kind of get some stuff where he's trying to assessing what's going on. He realises this is the man with the demon called heroin. And he slowly gathers from Eddie's thoughts that, he's a junkie and he's carrying this stuff and stuff like that. But we also get a sideline in this part, which I thought was really, again, it's King just amplifying a minor character into a fully fleshed human being, even with, not much sort of lines about them, which is the the air hostess, air
Jane.
stewardess, realising there's something quite sort of suspicious about this guy, and even noticing his eyes change colour. But first she notices him because she kind of fancies him. He's kind of a good-looking guy.
That's right. Eddie's a real charmer. That's how he's presented. He's got these hazel eyes. And Mark, this is very important later on, the eyes, because if you think about Roland, he's got these arresting blue eyes. And Eddie's eyes are this hazel kind of color. So as Roland walks through the door, well, first he looks through the door and he sees everything through Eddie's eyes. But when he actually goes through the door, he ends up in Eddie's head. He ends up as, occupying Eddie's body, and he can, in fact, take control of Eddie's body, but he opts not to do that from the get-go. But this is what I find interesting, Mark. Obviously, this air hostess, she notices something funny, because first his eyes are hazel, then it turns to blue as Roland comes to the fore. And did you notice that this air hostess, Jane Dorning or something, she has her own version of Court.
No,
if you know what I mean.
But no,
yes.
So tell me what.
Okay.
You mean who taught? Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, yeah.
Exactly.
Tell the listeners though.
She's, as you listeners might remember, Roland constantly thinks about his old instructor, Court, this real hard case, this drill instructor from hell that he had, who trained him in his gunslinger ways. Now, as this air hostess is noticing Eddie and she sees something off about his eyes and she suspects him of probably being a terrorist, she sort of dismisses that. She dismisses the whole train of thought because he's cute. But then she starts thinking, what did this old instructor, this real battle axe of an instructor that I used to have, say? And then she quotes the instructor. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's like, go with your gut. When you see something, don't dismiss it. Go with your gut.
Yeah.
And it sort of like harkens back to Court for me. this Jane Dorning having her version of Court in her flight school instruction days.
That's a good connection. I hadn't spotted that
weird.
One. Yeah, I could kind of see
weird.
Again, King fleshes out this sort of minor character in a sort of wonderful way, and he does the same with Eddie. Really, he gives us while Eddie's kind of sitting there feeling really nauseous and stuff like that. He doesn't actually. Eddie's think at one point, man, I got a big old baboon on my back, which makes Roland remember the tarot card.
Exactly.
But also we get this backstory of how the deal went down when he got the cocaine, where he had to deal with this English guy that was kind of trying to stiff him and stuff like that, and how Eddie dealt with that. Again, very vivid, very vivid. It had a touch of authenticity that King manages to pull out of somewhere.
Because you get a sense of Eddie's, as Roland calls it, the steel inside of him, even though he's a junkie, even though he's down on his luck, he's subjected to heroin, the constant need for a fix. You see Eddie standing up for himself, and in the face of this English drug dealer who's pulling a gun on him, and Eddie manages to top him in that situation. He gets out of that because Eddie's a fast talker and he's very intelligent, even though he doesn't have much of an education. But he's got this massive library of pop culture references, which he uses to insult people. And that's one of the things I love about him, is he can pull these insults out of a hat. And I don't have one at hand for this particular situation, but I'll mention some later when it gets to the mobsters. But we should mention that Eddie is coming with 9 pounds of cocaine strapped to his torso.
Oh, I thought it was 2 pounds. I thought it was.
Sorry. Was it 2 pounds?
Yeah,
sorry, you're right.
Would be a bit too much.
Yeah, that's too much. 2 pounds of cocaine, and he's coming over, and it's very professionally strapped to him, and that's why he's a little bit. Why the flight attendant is a little bit wary, of him, because obviously Eddie has this strapped to him, so he's also feeling a bit of anxiety. But at first, he's going to get through. It seems like it, right, Mark? It seems like
it does. But then he relaxes because I think Roland calms him down. But it doesn't also at one point Eddie feel a bit of pain in his hand to suggest he's got an empathetic link with Roland. But also he relaxes, leans forward, and that allows the stewardess to notice a weird line in his clothes that sort of indicate there's something stuck to him, right?
That's right.
And Roland realises, Eddie may not realise, but Roland realises that they've kind of been made, right?
Yeah, that's right, Yeah, he's more perceptive, but also, I mean, here we get a very cool sort of aspect to this whole door entering into another human body thing, where Roland realizes he can actually take things from Eddie's world back into his world, where he's hungry. He's starving, hasn't eaten properly in weeks, so he wants a sandwich. So as Eddie, he kind of forces Eddie to the back of Eddie's mind without Eddie knowing this happened. And Roland comes forward and he asks the stewardess for something to eat, and she gives him a tuna fish sandwich.
And here we get fish.
Tuta fish. Yeah, and Mark, now this is a great conceit in all the Dark Tower books, is Roland dealing with our world and the strangeness of our world. So we kind of, King makes us see through Roland's eyes. How would a person totally new to the 20th century react to things like tuna fish or medicine or, the abundance of firearms being sold, bullets, and that's what I love about all the Dark Tower books, is Roland having to come to grips with this 20th century modern world. It's kind of like funny in certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic archetypal story, isn't it? A fish out of water story. It's a classic one, and it works quite well. The one that made me laugh the most was the fact when he finds sugar. And he goes, maybe cocaine's just a different word for sugar, because they're both white powder, very addictive and delightful. And then he realises, no, it can't be that, because this is legal. Why would we smuggle something that's legal? And essentially, we get this really. There's Roland does also has another slip, doesn't he? Actually, say when he's controlling Eddie to the stewardess, "Thank you, Si." At one point, it was just, what?
Yes.
And there's that. And essentially, he has to tell Eddie all about it. He just there's very little subtlety about this. Roland just kind of tells Eddie how it is. And, he says, right, you've been made. We got to bring you out into my world so we can take remove the cocaine, and we get all of this thing where he actually goes into he's on the beach with Roland, and he kind of thinks, right, I think I've gone crazy. But
as anybody would.
Yeah,
that situation.
It kind of goes along with it and manages to they manage to get all the stuff off. I can't remember now. Does Roland kind of nick him with a knife at one point as well?
Yeah, because what happens is, like you say, he's been made by Jane Dorning. Roland was the first to realize this, and she kind of informed the rest of the staff and the pilot. So when they were landing, Roland came forward and then told Eddie, listen, they're going to keep you, they know what you're carrying, you've been made. So then Eddie quickly excuses himself to go to the bathroom, and then during this scene in the bathroom, he locks the bathroom door, but, they're already like thinking, okay, he's trying to flush the cocaine down the toilet. That's what the flight attendants are thinking. That's what's happening. So they're trying to get into the door. So Eddie doesn't have a lot of time, because as the passengers are disembarking, they're gonna break down the door, and you know how easy it is to break down the door to the loo on a plane. So he has to hurry to get rid of this cocaine. So Roland says he can take the stuff back for him, but the problem is it's strapped to his torso, and so Eddie has to literally go through the door with Roland, which seems possible here. Roland literally just turns him around, and then Eddie sees this floating door behind him. And then he walks through and he spots the lobstrosities. So he's obviously freaked out by that. But then Roland has to use his ridiculously sharp knife. I think Eddie comments on that. He says this knife can cut through almost anything. That's how sharp Roland keeps his gear. And then but they don't have a lot of time, because they can hear the banging on the lavatory door. And then Roland cuts. Well, no, Eddie has to do the cutting, I think. Isn't that right, Mark?
Yeah,
Because
Roland's in such a bad way. In fact, Eddie does mention
Yeah.
a few times that, you don't look good, pal. It's kind of
Yeah.
stuff like this. You can see
Exactly.
the tracks up Roland's arm where the blood poisoning or whatever it is, the
Yeah.
venom, whatever it is,
Yeah, the vein,
is getting into Roland's system.
that's right.
So
But long story short, they get through the door and Eddie's back. He ditched the stuff in that other world where Roland's keeping it. And then, he's pretending to take, have a bit of a number two there
yeah,
in
just
order to
sitting
make it
on
more
the-
awkward.
smiling when they press.
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah.
So
But he did nick himself. Yeah, like you
Yeah.
said, he's got a wound now, making them even more suspicious.
Yeah, and so the custom guys start grilling him, but Eddie's pretty tough cookie. He kind of stands up to it. At one point, he actually says, "I'll have a blood test, but only if everyone else in this room has a blood test with me." And they kind of like,
Yeah.
then he gets out through customs. I think Balazar kind of knows about it.
Yeah.
Knows that he got rumbled, but knows that he got out reasonably quickly. And Eddie keeps looking behind, and the cabbie goes, no one's following us, don't worry. But that's not what Eddie's looking at, because every time he looks behind him, he can see the door floating behind him.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
there's a mention there, where it's in the cab, where he says he can look through and he can see a lobstrosity eating a bird.
Snatching a gull from the air.
Yeah, wow. So
Whoa, horrific.
he gets on, but he gets Balazar's guys kind of pick him up pretty much straight away and sort of say they've got Henry. I've got Henry who's playing a game with them, Trivial Pursuit, but he's stoned out of his head. And interestingly, for every answer, he says Johnny Cash, who is
Johnny
the man in
Cash.
black, right? Who is the man in black?
That's right. That's the awesome part. And then actually later on, when they tried to give him an easy answer by saying, okay, who is this famous musician always dresses in black, and then instead of saying Johnny Cash, Henry ups with Walter Brennan.
Yeah.
So
I know,
it's a bit of comedy there from King.
They do
Great.
give him another injection, don't they, Henry, to keep him sweet?
Yeah.
But
His
accidentally,
final rocket.
Yeah, accidentally, either give him some bad stuff or give him too much, and he dies. This is a pure accident.
Yeah.
Now, this struck me as interesting that King does all of this with, he allows quite awkward things happening to his characters and kind of writes around it. But this felt like a right inconvenience, right? Because he needed to get Henry as part of it. And the only thing tying him to that world really was Henry. And Henry died pretty much straight away. But
That's right.
Such is life, right?
Yeah. I mean, as a writer, Mark, you can spot these little, inserts that King had to do probably to get his characters moving.
Yeah.
But for me, it the first time I read it, it flowed. But with subsequent readings, you're right. It's a little bit too on the nose, too obvious. But Mark, this is interesting. When Eddie's being picked up by the gangsters, obviously they're thinking that he cut a deal with the feds, because how did he get out so quickly through customs? It's only been 2 hours.
Yeah.
It's maybe not even enough time to cut a deal, but he's out of there. So obviously Balazar, in his mind, the mob boss, he's already thinking he's going to kill Eddie and his brother, but he just wants to know what happened to his stuff. So we, as the readers, are already privy to the knowledge that Balazar is thinking of, killing both of them. So this makes Eddie's situation more dire. And then, it turns out Balazar lives in a tower, which Roland freaks out the first time he sees it.
Yeah.
Do you remember that part? He starts screaming in Eddie's mind while they're approaching in the car with the other two mobsters. Yeah. And he starts freaking out. And Eddie says, no, it's just a building. It's modeled after the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Yeah, that's kind of funny. Essentially, he realises that Henry's... actually, first he says, I've got your stuff, but I'm going to go in the bathroom, bring it out with me. And they kind of search it, and it's like... but he does take one of the mobsters in with him, doesn't he, into the other world, Andolini.
Yeah, Jack Andolini.
And they kind of kill him. Well, the lobstrosities get him in the end.
Well, he died in an interesting way. Remember, he had sort of a fast draw a battle against Roland, if you remember, Mark. And then Roland had him beat, but Roland had a misfire because of the wet bullets.
Yes.
And then, Jack thought, okay, you're dead. And they keep calling Roland a spook. All these Italian mobsters. They said, they keep calling her Spook. And then Jack said something like, okay, you're dead, Spook. And then it turns out that Eddie, I think, distracted Jack or threw him with a rock. And then Roland fired a second bullet, and that bullet impacted. Roland says it's only happened once in his life. This is the second time where his bullet met Jack's bullet just as it came out of the chamber, and Jack's gun exploded in his hand.
I misread that. I thought Roland had just shot into the gun and set off the bullets. I misunderstood that. I also didn't get it the first time, but I was trying to reread that part because it seemed particularly horrific. King has these bits of horror, which he calls the gross out, as you know, from Danse Macabre, right? And this is definitely one of those, because he says Andolini's mangled hand, it looks like a piece of crumpled up toast, and his face has been blasted off by the resulting shrapnel. So then he wanders like this, handless and without a face, handless and faceless, into the ocean where the lobstrosities sort of greet him and pick him apart. Oh, that's a horrific death. Horrific death. Yeah, it's grim. So we get him dying, but then they both go back, and Roland's with Eddie right this time, and they're just going to kill everyone. And Roland's very happy. You can kind of tell Roland's in his element here.
Yeah, exactly.
And Eddie's just steaming mad because of his brother, right? Which kind of makes sense. And at this point, after all this carnage, he basically says, I want you to join me in my quest. And Eddie's like, well, I've got nothing better to do, kind of. And then we get to the second door. Now, that first section is probably the longest section in the book,
agree.
right? Yeah, it is pretty long.
Yeah.
We get to the second one, The Lady of Shadows, and this is where we encounter Adetta Holmes, who, this is in the 60s this time. She's a young black woman who has been left without legs in I say an accident. We find out the sort of deliberate nature of what happened to her. And she was also injured as a young girl by a brick to the head while she was walking back to a station with her parents, which unfortunately appears to have set up some sort of external personality. Sorry, not external. A second personality within her, who's called Detta. So there's this going on. And Odetta is kind of consciously unaware, but possibly subconsciously aware. It's kind of ambiguous about this second personality, who is called Detta Walker.
Now, Mark, she's kind of, this talk about dual personalities, they're completely opposite to each other. Odetta being this refined, rich lady, even though she's a black woman in the 60s, her father owns Holmes Dental, right? Who I think he developed this capping process that made him rich. And so everybody in the 60s kind of hates her, all the white people, because they don't like this, what they call this uppity sort of African-American who, and she's very involved with the social rights movement of the time, the civil rights movement.
But she's aware they have to treat her reasonably respectfully because she's actually got factories in towns around there. So if they mess with her, they might be putting a lot of people out of work, is what they're thinking. They mistreat her luggage, and they kind of won't let her go to the toilet, but they don't actually harm her directly. She's kind of protected because of this sort of trade and this business.
But that's the thing. Think about it. We only find out later. King only reveals it to us later that she that she's in a wheelchair, and that really disturbed me, because first you find out she's the schizophrenic, right? And then later on, as they open the door to the Lady of Shadows, where they eventually got to, Roland and Eddie. Got to the second door. They see through Data's Data at the time, Data's eyes, and it turns out that Eddie says it looks like kind of a steady cam, shot because of the way she moves. Because obviously this is different than what Eddie moved, than the way Eddie moved in, because she's in a wheelchair. But we don't realize this as readers yet until they talk about the accident, right?
Yeah.
because during this time, King sort of jumps back and forth between, present day Detta and the past and the accident that occurred. And I don't know if you agree with me, Mark, but Detta, she's kind of like some kind of a black shoplifting Aileen Wuornos kind of serial killing character.
She's I think King says this in the right. He does say this in the right. She's almost like a caricature character rather than a real person. She's full of, I think they use the word piss and vinegar, but certainly full of rage, absolute rage, and she sees everything as being against her. Right, and she wants to hurt people and annoy people and disrupt them and upset them. She deliberately kind of picks up boys and then rejects them at the last minute and laughs at them and even scratches their face. She's like a terrible human being. But she's this other side to this other personality within Odetta. And kind of Roland is kind of aware of the nature of this woman. He's kind of scared of her, and he eventually comes to realise there's two women there, and he's scared of the Detta one in particular. And he's also aware Detta is particularly scared of him.
Exactly. Yeah, she fears him. She calls him the really bad man.
The really bad man.
The really, really bad man.
Yeah. So there's this business about him. They catch her. They kind of see her shoplifting, and Roland, Eddie's kind of freaked out at this point, and actually says to Roland, "If you go back in," he wants basically he's in cold turkey, so he wants to go back into the world. He makes all sorts of excuses about wanting to help Roland, but essentially he wants to go back so he can score some more heroin. And Roland refuses, and he basically says to Roland, "If you go back, I'm going to kill your body here."
Yeah,
I mean it, man. I mean it, man. And Roland just sees what Detta's doing, and goes through the door. He doesn't even pay any mind. So Eddie's like got no bargaining potato.
No bargaining chips
whatsoever. Roland's really not playing it. Playing that game.
Exactly.
But he kind of goes back and gets her right, and she's kind of aware of him, and she gets sent back. So she was just shoplifting and stuff. But they also, when they get back, Odetta is there, right? And she kind of doesn't understand what's going on. They kind of explain to her. And again, this is a virtue of King's writing. This completely fantastic thing, it kind of works the way it's written. She kind of accepts that that's what they're telling her is how it was. And it doesn't feel false, does it?
No, because they mentioned something about Detta, or Odetta, I should say, the main personality, Odetta, the nice girl personality, that because she was hurt by a brick when she was a child, she doesn't quite believe what is happening to her. That's why she takes everything in stride. When Roland forcefully goes into her body, and then she's Detta. And when he takes her through the door, she immediately switches back to her Odetta personality. So when she gets to the beach with Eddie and Roland, she is in effect, Odetta again. So it seems that the traversal through the door, right, Mark, has a means of switching the personalities or sort of revealing them to each other, which causes the switch. But we're not quite sure about that at this point in time. But what does happen is she sees this entire episode on the beach where they sort of like have to push her to the third door as a dream, or not a dream, a hallucination induced by head trauma because of what happened to her as a child, with the brick. And she thinks she's been hit on her head by a baton or something because she had been in a protest recently in Oxford Town where police assaulted them. As they were doing the civil rights protesting. So now she's taken this all in stride, and she's talking to Eddie, but she's thinking he's a figment of her imagination. He's a hallucination. So that's why she's so calm about the whole thing. Yeah. And I found that a good technique of King, or a good kind of writing effect that he uses to explain Odetta's apparent acceptance of what's happening to her.
Indeed, it's well written, this, because I would have real trouble sort of writing this and feeling it was realistic, and King kind of does it effortlessly, really.
Mm,
Um, Then we come to the third door. I'm trying. This is the bit where I get hazy on this book. I've read this book. I think this is my third time I've read it, and I always get a bit hazy on what happens here because there's a lot of toing and froing, isn't there? In terms of the gunslingers getting weak. Now, if I remember rightly, they picked up when they were back in the gangster's place. They picked up some antibiotics.
Yeah, Keflex.
And brought it back.
Yeah.
So Roland was actually improving. But that ran out, and now he's kind of come back with a vengeance. So he's weakening, and he tells Eddie he has to take her up the beach, look for the door, and once he finds it, come back and get Roland. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And he tells her, whatever you do, do not leave her the gun. But they hear weird noises, and Eddie's kind of falling in love with her. Right?
That's right.
That's kind of falling for him too. So he gives her the gun, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Before he leaves Roland.
Mark, didn't you find this part, a little bit distressing? Roland, being almost similar to his teacher Court, he allowed Eddie to sort of burn his fingers, so to speak, at the first, when Roland saw, because the first time they got her onto the beach, she was Odetta, and then Eddie fell in love with her. But Roland had been in her mind when she was Detta. So he saw that Eddie was now totally, enamored with Odetta. So he knew that the personality of Detta would come back eventually. So he warned Eddie, but he saw that Eddie didn't heed his warning. So one night around the campfire, he just let Eddie experience, the full evil frontal assault of Detta for himself by saying he has to learn in order to internalize this threat from Detta. And literally what he did was he didn't react to Detta waking up and sort of trying to kill Eddie. And then Detta almost did, but, Eddie being almost like half a gunslinger at this point. Well, not half a gunslinger, but, he's got gunslinger chops. According to Roland, he sort of survived. But Roland did that to teach him a lesson, to saying that, we've got a snake in our midst and you better watch out, man. Don't let your libido get in the way.
I wondered if Roland would have done that if he was at full strength, or whether it was kind of because he was a bit... he
was conserving his strength and he was weaker than usual. I think you're right. At this point in time, he doesn't trust his faculties. So you're probably right. He's already leaning on Eddie a bit. But it is interesting that he says that now he doesn't have to worry about the fact that Eddie would maybe try to go back to our world in order to score a fix or heroin, because he has somebody else that he has to take care of. So Roland immediately he sees the psychological network or the psychological map that Eddie has in his mind already. He can understand Eddie because I think Roland's pretty good at reading people, and he sees that Eddie needs someone to depend on him. He needs someone to take care of, and he has this now. Now that he doesn't have Henry, he has this now in Odetta. Yeah, and so now Roland, that's not a problem that he needs to worry about, and that's kind of a nice way for King to also get rid of Eddie's threat of trying to score or get a fix again. I found that kind of elegant, or maybe that was unplanned on Stephen King's part. Could have been one of his subconscious, ideas. But I found this very elegant, and that leads us into this whole part with the man in shadows. Oh, sorry, the death, right? The third door. With a name on it.
Yeah,
Death.
just to go back a bit though. One of the things I really enjoyed. There was some nice little side sort of streets King wandered down during this whole section. For example, the paramedics talking about. There's a whole scene where the paramedics are helping.
Great scene.
Adetta once she gets her legs cut off, and they kind of recognised that wasn't the woman they were treating. There was something strange about this woman. It wasn't just the injury. There was something else going on. And there was also some really nice asides where Eddie observes, as does Roland, through Adetta's eyes. And as you say, he does compare it to a steady cam, and Roland doesn't want to know what that is. But Eddie also says something like, it's making me think of the kid riding around the corridors in The Shining.
Exactly. So he's referencing himself. He's referencing the Stanley Kubrick,
which comes up big in the Dark Tower later on.
Oh yeah. I mean, later it just escalates to the point that you know what's going to happen. We're not going to spoil that yet, but it's insane.
So there's some good stuff there. And then there's some nice stuff where Odetta explains to Eddie what happened for her to get the scar, and then we get the backstory of her getting the brick on her head.
Now, it's important to mention, Mark, that the brick was pushed, from a building above, and also Odetta, when she was an adult, she was pushed in front of the train. Yeah. This didn't just happen; it was a deliberate.
There's the same person. It's the causal agent. Did both, right? We
exactly, and eventually. If the listeners remember the previous episode on the gunslinger, Jake, the boy that Roland met at the way station, he died in our world before he came over to Midworld. Sorry, Midworld. Yeah, it's Midworld.
Yeah, it's Midworld.
I thought I said Middle Earth. Sorry, the Tolkien. No, Midworld. Recently, a friend on the UNH site, I commented about, this is King's Tolkien. And the friend Paul, he said something to me, it's called Midworld. So, where do you think King got that name from? Yeah. And for me, that never really clicked because, the Dark Tower is so far removed from the Lord of the Rings. But sorry, that's now off a script, Mark. Sorry. But, in terms of Jake was pushed. Yes. In front of traffic.
And in the Gunslinger, it's you think it was the Man in Black that pushed him, because Man in Black turns up and pushes his way to the front, doesn't it? It says, "I'm a priest, let me through," while he's gloating over the death of the boy. But we find out he didn't actually push Jake. This character Jack Moore pushed Jake. Now, ultimately, it's kind of suggested in the various bits of this universe, King universe, in various different media, that the Man in Black was basically using Jack Moore as his own agent, possibly subconsciously or unknowingly, as far as Jack Moore's concerned. But ultimately, the Man in Black is behind it, or Martin, or Walter, or whatever you want to call it. So there is that kind of relationship. There's some wonderful little sides here that kind of fill all this out. In a lesser writer's hand would just feel baggy and kind of superfluous and not and diffusing the narrative drive, but never get bored in this book.
No, I agree completely.
Happy with every word, pretty much, right? It kind of, even when it's startling, it's kind of interesting. And I, like I say, the first time I remember it, I was kind of shocked that he would pick such a character with so many problems as one of the main characters. And it was like, why would you write something like that? That's just making it so difficult for yourself. But in the end, King makes it so that you can't really imagine it being another way.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. He sort of provides the cure for schizophrenia in this book, Mark, right? Because, I mean, psychologists and psychiatrists have theorized that if you can get the two personalities to accept each other, then they will sort of reconcile and become one. But obviously that's all theoretical. But you can't really do that in real life. But through the use of these doors, it turns out that there might be a way that Odetta and Detta Walker and Odetta Holmes, the two personalities, can become one if they are allowed to see each other face to face.
And they do, don't they? And that causes
they do later on.
That comes later on.
So this is King again, like fixing the problems that you mentioned, the problems that we see as insurmountable. He comes up with a way. Yeah, very imaginative way, very creative.
So ultimately, Roland has to go through the third door, the prisoner. We do get some to and fro about Detta after this, where she kind of captures Eddie and kind of threatens to take him down to the lobstrosities as bait to lure Roland. This bit I'd completely forgotten about. It was like, man, I'd forgotten this happened, because I was more concerned with what Roland was up to.
See, The reason for that, Mark, is because Jack Mort, the third member, well, he's not actually a member of what will become Roland's quartet, as Roland calls it, because Roland's already been espousing his philosophy to Eddie, right, about Ka. Yeah. And it's more than a philosophy; it's a religion, sort of, from his world. And so Eddie's become aware of Ka, but he's also become aware that Ka is an actual force, because when Roland goes through the doors and he's in your head, he describes himself as being pure Ka, right?
Yeah.
So Jack Mort doesn't really have that. He is linked to Roland's band, but he is not a member. He's actually the sort of progenitor of their suffering and their woes.
It's kind of Judas in the Jesus story, right? That's what he is. He precipitates their woes, but that binds them together as a quartet.
Exactly,
Yeah.
And the storyline basically just is about Roland needing more penicillin to combat the returning blood infection. So, I find that the Lady of Shadows bit and the last bit, which is in fact called the Pusher. I was in error earlier. I said it's called Death. But Jack Mort, his name obviously meaning death. I just got confused there for a moment.
Well, in the tarot reading, it says death, but not for you, Gunslinger.
Yeah.
Right? So, the third card.
Yeah.
So I kind of see that. They do get some trouble with death. So, for example, when they're trying to sleep, she starts screaming. And in the end, Roland basically has to threaten us. And, well, I don't really want to give you a silent gag because they can be dangerous, but I will.
Yeah, because she has to. Yeah,
right. Stop.
Yeah, you're right. Because she's trying to throw a spanner into the works, because they essentially, even though Roland's weakening again, they have to push her in the wheelchair from door number 2 to door number 3 over this a long stretch of beach. They can't even see the third door yet, and then she constantly tries to derail them by, like you say, screaming in the middle of the night, robbing them of their sleep, trying to rock the wheelchair back and forth, upsetting the wheelchair. And they say it takes them, like 5 minutes to get her upright again?
Yeah. Because,
they're on this...
laughing at them and stuff.
Yeah.
She refuses all food, says they're trying to poison her. She talks like as if they've been raping her. Or maltreating her, like that's how she remembers it. And I think I've already mentioned it. What Eddie at one point thinks, it's not like she's a real person. She's almost like a caricature.
Yeah, exactly.
Of someone, or
Butterfly
someone
McQueen
imagining how their sort of person is, right, rather than like actually being it.
Yeah, well, I think I've got a bit of a theory on that. I think Odetta, when she was a little girl, she had to dealt with the whole racial prejudice directed towards her family, because she was already rich when she was born, her family, her dad. And, so she grew up refined, but every time she saw a caricature of a black person on film or on the screen, like she mentions Butterfly McQueen from, Gone with the Wind, she probably felt very, very, like it was a very derogatory form of portraying the African American at the time, which it was. And it must have had an impact on her, and she internalized that. And so when she eventually became Detta Walker after the brick fell on her head, after that caused her schizophrenia, I think she subconsciously modeled Detta on the worst aspects of how white people portrayed black people during the time.
That's definitely how it feels. It's also interesting that her accident that caused all this is actually a direct result of sort of racial discrimination. Her family ordered a taxi to go to the station, and when the driver saw they were black, he just drove off. And their father was like embarrassed and angry and didn't want to call another one because didn't want it to happen again. Really?
Yeah, so they walked. Yeah. So I didn't think about that, Mark. That's a good point. Yeah, it all goes back to the whole racial thing, with Odetta, her origin, and in fact, at the time when Roland took her, she was, embroiled in the civil rights movement, and everything you mentioned, is true. It has a real racial connotation. I think Stephen King was very, active during his time as a student, so he does feel very strongly about these civil rights issues. He mentions in all of his memoirs and stuff how he protested, and I think there's even this great picture of him that you can find online, this bearded kind of like giant looking, almost sort of like he looks like a lumberjack standing in this crowd of students. Have you ever seen that photo, Mark, of him protesting?
No, but I was just thinking, he's very even-handed. He wasn't like, oh yeah, everything. He wasn't one to go along with the crowd, right? Because he talks about in Danse Macabre, he went to a sort of student meeting about when the Black Panthers were present. And they were talking about how everything's geared for the military-industrial complex and lied to. And he says, nah, that isn't happening. And,
no.
And he kind of gets shouted down,
Yeah, he was definitely more a Martin Luther King guy than a Malcolm X guy. I'm sure. Yeah, he wasn't very militant.
Yeah,
no, I agree with you there. Yeah. But in terms of the last bit of the book, I agree with you because the fact that the characters of Eddie and Odetta and Detta, the second personality, are so well developed, you kind of like give Jack Mort, the Jack Mort section, the pusher, a short shrift, if you know what I mean.
It feels more like one of action rather than character, right? That's how that section feels compared to the rest of the book. We basically find out Jack Mort's basically a sociopath that likes hurting people, often by pushing. And it could be pushing them, or it could be pushing something onto them, right? It's pushing, essentially.
Yeah. If I have to describe... Yeah, sorry. Go on, Mark. Sorry, I was...
So essentially, he created Odetta and Detta and also created the loss of her leg. So he's damaged her twice.
Yeah. Which is Ka again. Ka again working its devious ways, right?
And he should have killed Jake, but Roland stopped him pushing the boy. Which creates issues later on in the Dark Tower series. So they all kind of interlink around this one character. I mean, Eddie's not so much, perhaps, but... Eddie
doesn't seem to have a connection to Roland as clearly as, Odetta and Jake does. I mean, they're definitely connected to Roland through the pusher.
Yeah, there are connections from Eddie and the Man in Black in other media concerned with the Dark Tower, which I'm not going to get into now because that's something else.
But Mark, when I think about this final bit, the pusher section, this is just how I summarize it in my mind. It's basically, for me, if I have to remember one thing about it, it's for me Roland versus the NYPD.
Yeah, and he thinks, the gunslingers are fat, aren't they? And
but one of them remembered the face of his father. One of them, a young gunslinger. Yes. That's what he said, meaning the one cop who actually was on the ball, and he did manage to kind of shoot Roland in the body of Jack Mort. Because Roland immediately saw what Jack Mort was, so he wasn't having any truck with first observing. When he went through the door of the pusher, he immediately took control of Jack Mort's body, because at this point in time, Roland didn't have a lot of time left. Eddie was on the beach alone with Detta, and Detta had escaped at that time, if you remember, Mark. She had crawled into the sort of the hills or the scree. Yeah,
and was waiting possibly to shoot them. Right? Yeah.
Stalking them,
again, that's a bit I always forget.
But then because of that, because of Eddie, being on the beach alone, and Roland needed new penicillin, he kind of had to use Jack Mort right from the get-go. He had to control him in order to get bullets, because they were running out of bullets. Half of their bullets were duds anyway because of all the, water damage it had sustained. And Roland was again, suffering from the fever. So immediately he just, took control of Jack Mort, went to a pharmacy and went to, a gun shop to buy bullets. And that part I really enjoyed, because he comes up with this great way of getting the bullets from this.
Yeah, he gets the cops going and then knocks the cops out. I don't understand that. Why does it? In terms of why doesn't he just rob him without getting the cops involved? But it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah,
it's kind
of
funny,
point in time,
actually.
Yeah, he didn't have any weapons, so he literally had to, find a way. But that's again Court's training and the gunslinger's way of thinking. Like you find a solution, it reminds me of Mark. Have you ever read any Lone Wolf and Cub?
Yes, I have. Yes.
Manga. there's another series called Path of the Assassin, which was also written by that writer, and it sort of tests the young samurai and the young ninjas by coming up with this impossible situation that they have to solve. And one of the kids at that point in time, sorry, this is a total aside, but I think Roland he's really similar to these, samurai type of characters too, especially Ogami Ito from, Lone Wolf and Cub, because he's this driven individual. He's obsessed with the tower, and a similar obsession in Ito's life. And as a child, these young samurai had to deal with a situation where they have to rob from a merchant, which is similar to what Roland does when he robs the gunsmith. But the problem is the father of the young samurai says, you have to rob from the merchant without physically hurting him and without him knowing that you've robbed him. and you have to rob a specific item. And the item that, the father suggests is a large vase, a vase that is so large that it's almost high, taller than the little samurai who actually has to rob this vase. So, they have to find a way around that. So what the samurai does is he walks into the store. This is the little kid samurai now. And he pickpockets probably 20 or 30 small items, right? Then he comes back with the small items and shows it to his father. And his father says, this is not what I instructed you to do. You're supposed to rob the vase, the impossible task. And then the little samurai says, well, basically what I did is, I'm pickpocketing these items. I'm going to pawn them at another shop and use the money I get from that shop to buy the vase.
All right.
And thereby stealing the vase. So this is Roland, too. He's coming up with this kind of impossible way to get what he needs. But eventually it's not that, he does resort to violence, but it's kind of smartly written, I think, by King, because you don't always see Roland as a subtle, he's more direct, but in this case we see a bit of his intelligence, his craftiness.
Yeah, I mean, there's one point, he has control of Jack Moore, but Jack Moore sometimes gets control back, and it's like saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And he says, well, okay, but I'll take your eye out if you don't. It's up to you.
Oh, yeah.
So, he forces it. And essentially, it's almost a race against time, isn't it? Where the cops are after him. All he wants is medicine and bullets.
Yeah.
And to wipe out this despicable man, essentially, because of what he's done and the way he is. So it's kind of a quite strongly narratively driven section compared to the others, which makes it memorable in a different way, right? It does make it is memorable. I did remember this section, but it's all about the action rather than the character. We're not given that much insert into this man's personality, other than he's thoroughly terrible.
Yeah, he's a serial killer, and that's it. Yeah, the only other thing I can remember of him is his colleagues fear him. He works as some kind of an insurance agent or a broker. I'm not sure, but everybody does sense something off about him.
Yeah.
But he's not an interesting character. He's just a foil, I think, for the story to progress, and I think wisely written by King like that, because you don't want to sympathize with a serial killer.
No.
I mean, there are of course, novels out there, Thomas Harris and whatnot, where you sympathize with Hannibal Lecter but in this case, this guy, I think King read it rightly. He didn't want to go too deep into this character. And think about it, Mark, that's a weird thing to do, because the reader at this point in time, before they get to the pusher door, we're thinking this is going to be the third member of Roland's new quartet. Yeah,
and it isn't resolved, is it, in terms of a third member? Oh, it can. Well, it depends how you interpret the text. It could be, I suppose the gunslinger's the third. Or it could be, a debtor and debtor are two people. So they're the third. There's several ways of interpreting that.
Yeah.
It's interesting that this Jack Moore guy always makes me feel like, it makes me think maybe this is Patrick Hofstadter from It grown up. Right.
Oh, yeah.
It's got a very similar sort of vibe about.
Very similar vibe, killing the animals when he's young, which is the route most serial killers go. Yeah, he's definitely a Hochstetter type. And King does write great serial killers. I mean, the serial killer from the Dead Zone, I always remember.
Greg Stilson.
Greg Stilson is a great, a serial killer, hiding in plain sight kind of thing. And all of King's
Oh
serial
no,
killers.
sorry, Greg Stilson was the politician. There was another chap in the Dead Zone, wasn't there? That was the killer.
Oh yeah, sorry. Oh,
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
right. That was the
I
politician.
can't remember
Yeah, sorry.
what. Yeah, I'm not going
No,
to talk
but
anymore because I think I'll spoil
no.
it. However, I have already covered it. So, oh, have I? I'm not sure now.
Oh yeah, I listened to it recently.
Okay.
Mark. That's why I brought it up.
Yeah,
But I
it
should
was
remember the
it was
name.
the
I'm sorry.
policeman was the
Yeah,
fella, wasn't it? A
yeah.
policeman. Yeah. Anyway, all of this basically precipitates down, and Adetta kind of also comes to realise that this Jack Mort kind of did this. I think I'm not absolutely sure now. Thinking
No,
about it.
you're right. No, she does. She does. Yeah.
And this kind of then causes this synthesis within Adetta of the two personalities into this third person who she just decides to call herself Susanna, which is her middle name, right? Susanna Dean.
Susanna Dean. Yeah, Yeah, exactly.
Who then goes ahead to rescue Eddie from the lobstrosities.
Yeah, well, that part was great, Mark. When Roland at this point in time, he's unsure if his plan worked, because his plan essentially was to take the body of Jack Mort to into the subway or wherever the A train in New York is coming from.
Yeah,
and he's essentially going to, at the point where he's going to let Jack Mort leap in front of the train, he's going to turn around and he's hoping that at that point in time, Detta will be looking through the door, looking through his eyes at Jack Mort and himself.
Yeah.
Because was basically recreating the moment of her birth,
Yes.
or her rebirth, I should say, because she was reborn after Odetta initially lost her legs. Even though she was initially born when the brick hit the head, she only came fully into reality once her legs were severed. So this is sort of Roland getting her to come to grips with what happened, because Detta is sort of a survival reflex born of this moment. So he's recreating this moment and showing her that at the same time she's getting justice. I don't want to say revenge, because in Detta's mind it would be revenge, but for Odetta it would be justice. By witnessing the death of Jack Mort, the person who had caused this, the self-same way that she was born. Death, does lead to new life. So this led to the two personalities seeing each other and facing each other and realizing.
Kind of separating too, right? They kind of separate and fight, and Odetta hugs Detta, and they kind of become synthesized into this third personality, Susanna,
who can still draw upon Detta's fearsomeness and, will at times. If you remember in later books, Mark, she does sometimes lapse into her Detta Walker personality again, but then she's a force for good. Her powers being channeled towards, a purpose rather than just destruction. So no, I found this again elegant writing on King's part. Indeed. Because he found a great way to reconcile this character. So again, another problem solved. Eddie's problem has been solved with the heroin addiction. Now, he's in love with Susanna, the new character formed from, Detta and Odetta's merging. And, he solves the second problem, and then he solves the third problem of Jack Mort as well. And if readers have read ahead in the series, he solves another problem related to a stain on his character.
Indeed.
If you know what I mean, when he went into the Man in Black, and the Man in Black, in fact, did not push Jake in front of the car, which is Roland. Well, I don't know. Should we spoil it further, Mark? I don't know.
No. Let's leave that.
Let's not go further with that. Yeah.
Essentially, and then this story kind of ends with Susanna and Eddie and Roland. Roland's got a lot of bullets and penicillin now, right? And there's even a bit of neat writing where it's basically there's also got vitamin deficiencies, but he says, we find vegetation, we'll get vegetation to do that.
Yeah, because they were suffering from scurvy there for a while too.
Yeah, they got scurvy. Eddie, who's basically, starting to get clean now, is over the worst withdrawal pain, and he's kind of fallen in love with Susanna, and there's this kind of sad moment where Roland's he talks to Eddie, realizes he likes Eddie, but he realizes, in his heart, he's going to just sacrifice them all just to get to the tower.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a mournful ending. So in some ways, this story, there's a few sort of cultural sort of links I saw in some of this story. One thing I haven't mentioned yet, which I kept meaning to and I forgot, was the whole Odetta sort of split personality thing made me think a lot of an episode of Star Trek where Captain Kirk goes through a transport and gets split into good and bad personalities. And those kind of... Basically, we find out the bad personality is his like force, his drive. And the good personality, while it's good and kind and that, doesn't know how to resolve things or, can't deal with conflict. And it's kind of the synthesis back into the whole is what makes Kirk what he is. It kind of made me think of that.
Wasn't that... I remember that episode, The Enemy Within, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
I just, because recently I've been on this Star Trek binge, and I not recently watched it, probably a year ago, I watched that on Netflix. It's a great episode. So let's recommend this to the listeners, because actually, Mark, this episode is very apt. It's almost exactly the Data dynamic.
Indeed.
That you
Kirk
described.
Is kind of... the bad Kirk is kind of making decisions, but he's also kind of attacks Yeoman Rand, for example, and stuff like that. Whereas the good Kirk is a good man, but he's a terrible leader and decision maker. It's only the two of them coming together. They have to join back together otherwise he's going to die, basically. It kind of made me, that whole thing made me think of the Detta Susanna resolution. The other thing this reminds me of is this whole, gunslinger gathering people to help him on his quest makes me think a lot of Roland gets compared to the man with no name, right? This whole thing, sort of joining into to make a sort of team for this quest made me think a lot of the way Outlaw Josie Wells, the movie Outlaw Josie Wells, kind of resolves, in that he's a badass loner who's completely lethal, but he slowly gets a band of misfits that he protects around him. Not only is he protecting them, but they help him rediscover his humanity, which Roland is kind of doing here somewhat.
Exactly. I'm almost willing to say that King almost directly took this from Josie Wells, because he's obviously a fan of Clint Eastwood's character in The Man with No Name, but the outlaw Josie Wells being a different character, King must have sort of subconsciously taken that to heart, because Mark, a lot of Roland's character is based on those 60s spaghetti western characters, even his character arcs. Like you mentioned, the gunslinger is basically him being the good, the bad, and the ugly, a fistful of dollars type. But then slowly he becomes the outlaw Josie Wells, which is sort of the progression that Eastwood takes in those movies too. So I think this is King subconsciously writing, the flicks, the movies that he loved from way back when that inspired the gunslinger.
Indeed. And in fact, if you watch the film Fistful of Dollars, in microcosm, it is the entire arc of he only fails or gets laid low when he attempts to help someone that he doesn't have to help, right?
Exactly.
And that's how he becomes a cropper. So it's interesting, that very first film has a microcosm for all of this, if you watch it in that context.
I completely agree.
So, it's an interesting take. Yes.
Yeah. I just want to, Mark, I got this one quote here that I highlighted with my, first reread of the book, a month ago, that I want to read. There's this constant, obsession with Roland in the Tower, and Eddie is the first to actually realize. In fact, am I wrong, Mark, in saying that Eddie was the first character in the Dark Tower books to make Roland laugh?
I can't remember him laughing before this.
no, he never laughed before this, because obviously Cuthbert probably made him laugh, but we're never told that until much later. But Eddie, there's a part where Eddie is going to commit suicide, You'll get to the reason why I'm mentioning this later on. Eddie wants to commit suicide, but so he puts Roland's gun to his temple, and then he doesn't. And then Roland asks him later, "What did you do?" While Roland was out, in this sort of fever-like coma. And Eddie says, "No, he almost killed himself, but the only thing that stopped him from killing himself was the realization that he only had this one pair of pants. So if the bullet was a dud." Caused by the water damage, then he would have crapped his pants, meaning there wouldn't have been another pair of pants that he could have worn. And then Roland just burst out in this gale of laughter, And I found that, like you say, the outlaw Josie Wells becomes more human. That's one of the first signs that Roland is completely now becoming human. Because think about it, when he met Jake in the first novel, he was not completely human yet. In the end, when he sacrificed Jake to get to the tower, he, in fact, sort of regained that level of robotic, drive that he had in the beginning of the novel. But here, Eddie has completely wormed his way into Roland's heart. He even compares Eddie to Cuthbert later on, and this is now, like you say, Roland on the path to what could be strength, but could also be his downfall. And there's this other great quote, Mark, about, I think Eddie said this to Roland. Eddie has a real insight into Roland's heart, which sort of humanizes Roland even more. I think Eddie tells him, he says, if you have given up your heart for the tower, you have already lost, because a heartless creature is a loveless creature, and a loveless creature is a beast. And to be a beast is bearable, but if you want to pay hell's own price in the end for gaining your obsession, then you will gain the Dark Tower, but you will become a monster in the process. So what good is it to gain your objective, but to become a monster in the process?
Yeah.
And, you kind of, to pay hell is one thing, but do you want to own it? Do you want to become the devil himself? And that is for Eddie to have that insight into Roland from the get-go and to still follow him and to accept him, because he knows that Roland will step over their dead bodies just to get to the tower. This is a big thing between Eddie and Roland, a big back and forth, which we'll find later on in the novel. And I find that a very good kind of insight for readers in the second novel. It shows us where it's going to go later on.
Yeah, indeed. Let's sum up what we kind of think of this book now. Shall I go first?
Yeah, please, Mark.
I think this is a really interesting one. This is pretty... I mean, we've got the Gunslinger as the precursor, but the Gunslingers are much more... I mean, it's got some great elements, but it's a much more...
surface-level character.
Yeah, in many ways, the relationship between, I think, the Gunslinger in this book is kind of similar to A Fistful of Dollars and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, actually.
Yes,
or
exactly.
Even for a few dollars more, which is a much more human, oriented story. It's. I mean, The Gunslinger came first, but this is quite an unusual book in the King canon at this point. It is quite a bit unlike anything else we've had so far. In fact, if it's near anything else, or it's not quite the Gunslinger, it's possibly closer to maybe the Talisman, maybe.
Yes. Yes.
And possibly, oh man, what's that one? I've forgotten it. Yeah, the Talisman. Yeah, the Talisman is closest. But this is a way better book than that. In my opinion.
I agree. I think, King is kind of hampered when he has to write with other people. I know a lot of people won't agree. I mean, Straub's a great writer, but I think, you have to kind of, King's one of those writers, you have to let him have his way.
Yeah.
Let him conjugate with his muse. You can't have a threesome with King and his muse.
King's Quartet is two. Him and his muse, right?
Yes, good point.
This is a very unusual book. I'm kind of. I think if I'd have read The Gunslinger when it first came out, the wait for this one would have driven me a bit mad, frankly. But this really works well for me. This really does explain the Dark Tower for me. It took me a few reads to really appreciate The Gunslinger. This book only took me one read, and I do remember being constantly surprised with both King's decision making and what we were getting from this book. And it's still a surprising book. This is the third read, and it still surprises me. I'm still kind of taken aback by the audacity of what it's covering, really. It's so unusual and strange. So I think it's a very solid King book per se. And I think it might be my second favourite of the eight, sorry. My second favourite book. It may be. Until I read them again, I can't be absolutely sure, but I really do like this one.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Good point, Mark. Well, wow. How can I follow up with that? Basically, you said everything I want to say. But I will say that, this book, definitely a 4 out of 5 star book for me. I think I rated The Gunslinger a little bit too high. I think I also gave it 4 out of 5 stars. In retrospect, I should have given it a 3.5, because here we get a lot of character development, and we get very memorable new characters that are introduced. I think, I recently saw a poll a couple of months back, on the Stephen King, Facebook group, Constant Reader Facebook group, where they, asked for who's your favorite characters, and Susanna Dean and Eddie Dean made almost all the lists that I could see. So because of those two characters that King introduced in this book, I would have to say this is one of my favorite. But my favorite Dark Tower book is definitely still the fourth one, Wizard in Glass.
And mine, yes.
But, it's because it's got such a rich story, and, but in terms of, I think this is neck and neck for me with Song of Susanna, which is my second favorite, which is not a lot of people's favorites. A lot of folks call that an interstitial kind of novel, sandwiched in between two big novels in the series. But for me, the reason why I like this one is because of the introduction of Eddie Dean and Susanna, but also because it showed me what a great action scene writer Stephen King is. I mean, the scene with the shootout in the Leaning Tower where Eddie fights naked and Roland comes through the door, and it's just page after page of action and violence, and it's like an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie at this point in time. It just escalates. And for me, this is the first time I encountered King writing this riveting action scene. Yeah. And later on, again, when he's fleeing the police in Jack Mort's body, you have the same effect. It's kind of like a chase scene through New York, and again, written very well.
The Jack Mort one was kind of amazing, because at one point he even caught on fire, but Roland still drove him on to do stuff, right? It was just very cool.
It was great, and he gets shot, and then rather than die, there's like a pocket knife, or there's a lighter that blocks the bullet, and that's where the fire comes from, igniting Jack Mort's coat is from the bullet piercing the pocket lighter that he has. And it's just so ridiculous, but it's things you would see in an action movie, these things happening to protect the protagonist. And this is why I like this book, because it was so different from the previous King stuff that I've read. Yeah. But it's still similar, because he kept the horror vein, with the monsters, the monstrosities, with Deta Walker being thoroughly evil. But the characters in this weird offbeat setting just came through for me so strongly. So for a writer to be able to do that in this kind of ridiculous world that he's set up, which is just basically taking place on this beach with these doors leading to our world and back, the characters felt completely realistic to me, as they do in most King books.
Yeah,
but most King books. Yeah.
It's a startling book, isn't it? It's kind of it twists and turns in such a bizarre way, but it doesn't feel phony.
Exactly,
it feels right for the story. And it's kind of and that's why I think it surprises me every time I come back to it, because it kind of, how does this even work? And it just does. It just does.
Yeah, exactly, Mark. So no, because of that, and I agree. You can summarize what I want to say in a very short, form. I'm sorry, I'm doing it the long-winded way. But Mark, for the next show we'll do, because we don't have time for it now, I want to compile a list of Eddie Deanisms, by which I mean his one-liners. They are great. And I've got a few of them here, but I'm going to leave that for another show, because just that fact alone, that Stephen King came up with these creative ways of insulting and expressing pop culture through Eddie Dean, that alone is majestic.
Yeah.
The way
There
he's
is,
written that stuff.
there is one that comes in a later book, and I can't remember exactly which book. I always think of this not always, but I often think of this when I think of Eddie Dean, which is they've all been on the road for ages, eating sort of barely, and they get to a place and are celebrated, and they get a big meal with like lovely cakes and stuff like that. And Eddie sits back and he basically says, tomorrow I'm going to make a great big steamer rather than the rabbit poop we usually have to do, and I'm going to enjoy it. And like Roland laughs at that too. And it's just so memorable. It's so Eddie Dean, right?
Yeah, no, he's great. No, definitely my favorite character, bar none, when it comes to King.
Yeah.
So no, a great book, Mark. Thanks for having me on to talk about it, because it's one of my favorites.
Thank you for coming on. It's been a real pleasure to have you. Tell us a bit about your podcast.
Oh yeah. I guess the Kingology listeners won't mind, but the UNH listeners have probably gotten enough of me by now. I recently recorded a comic book podcast with your other two significant others, Mark, Becky and the God. But yeah, I went into in depth there. But basically just a short summary. I'm a massive comic book fan, but I did read superheroes as a child, but I never completely went the whole hog on the superhero fandom. I've always been a horror guy. Horror is the first, and second, I would be a sword and sorcery kind of fantasy comic book fan. But horror is definitely it for me. And I just got tired of being on podcasts with friends discussing superheroes. So I decided to start my own one-man show called The Long Box of Darkness, and discussing, horror comic books. And I'm a bit of an amateur horror comic historian, so I've got this history segment in it, and I've been researching that for a couple of years. So it's finally coming to fruition. And, we're only 10 episodes in. Well, it's technically 12, but there's been some interlude episodes. But 10 proper episodes in, and, discussing horror comics all across the board, not just the Marvel and DC stuff, but also, the Independence, Dark Horse, Image, and all of that. So, Mark, just to give your listeners a bit of a preview, you're going to be featured on one of those episodes.
Yes, I raised a particular old favourite of mine, and managed to track down a copy, and you've read it too, and hopefully we're going to be discussing it, aren't we?
That's gonna be
in the near future. I'm really looking forward to that too. You, I hope, will be returning when we come back to the Dark Tower 3, which is a way away at the minute. There's quite a few books between that number 2 and number 3 in the Dark Tower, but hopefully this quartet will reform, and we'll get to the Dark Tower 3 at some point in the middle future, I'd say.
Oh, thanks, Mark. I'll gladly come back. And speaking as a follower of a din like yourself, as they come to call Roland later on, I appreciate it. Yeah, it's really given me a new perspective on the series, coming onto the podcast and discussing it. So please, if you're willing, I will definitely be back.
That'd be awesome.
For the third one.
I've got to say this. Thank you, Si.
Thank you, Si. Oh, why didn't I think of that? Damn. Awesome,
okay,
Mark.
then.
Awesome.
We'll wind
Long days and pleasant nights.
Yeah, here we go. Oh, man. Okay, I think we'll wind out there. So, goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
And until next time on Kingology.